Hey guys, what is going on? And welcome back to WWE Rivalries on the WWE podcast. It's Friday, October 16th, as we are just blazing through the fall here. You know, the NHL wrapped up, the NBA recently wrapped up, the MLB is well on its way to finish up the World Series, and pretty soon all we'll be left with is the NFL, which is the machine that just keeps on turning. And it's just so crazy because I remember I guess around late July when all the sports started trickling its way back into the equation and we were kind of just overwhelmed. I believe there was one weekend in August where literally every single sport was on the TV, including golf and tennis and what have you. And pretty soon we're just going to be left with the NFL. But I think the Masters are next week. I'm not very privy to what's going on in the world of golf, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. But if you're a huge sports fan like myself, you kind of realize that we were spoiled for a good period there in the late summer after having nothing at all in terms of content for the better part of, I would say, 4 months when COVID first hit. But look, guys, I'm glad you're here to join us. I'm really excited to get into it this week because I'm going to continue down the theme of faction rivalries, and this week we are going to take a time travel back to 2014 with the Shield versus Evolution. So yeah, a pretty way more recent rivalry than we've been accustomed to through, I guess, the first 8 weeks. I think we're 8 weeks into this rivalries experiment together. And look, I gotta say, just to this point, I know it's still relatively new and we have a long way to go here, but I cannot express how grateful and thankful I am for you guys to tuning into the show each and every week. How grateful I am for Matt to have given me this opportunity and this platform to talk about the more nostalgic things in wrestling that is just my bread and butter when it comes to WWE. So really excited to get into WWE rivalries this week between the Shield and Evolution. But before we get there, as always, I want to give my thoughts on the current product. And I'll start, I guess, with the draft because that is the biggest news. I was pretty satisfied with what they did. It seemed like a lot of mid-card guys swapped brands. For instance, going to SmackDown, I said that I wanted this to happen, and it did. Kevin Owens going there. I think that is huge. They really needed a big-time babyface, and Kevin Owens is the guy to do it. You know, many people forget that, for all intents and purposes, he was the first ever Universal Champion. I know technically it was Finn Balor, but he relinquished it a night after winning it, and then Kevin Owens went on I believe it was a 4 or 5 month run with it. He held it from August to late February when he infamously dropped it to Goldberg. But look, I think there's still a lot of main event left in Kevin Owens, and he hasn't really gotten back there since early 2017, and I really want to see him as a babyface. I'm not saying that he has to win the title now or even in the near future, but I still would like to see him get back into that picture. And given the small amount of top baby faces on SmackDown and challengers and potential challengers for Roman Reigns' Universal Championship, he is a guy that I really want to see. And I'm not expecting it to be necessarily right away. I'm not sure how far they're going to drag out this Jey Uso program with Roman Reigns. One would have to imagine that it ends inside Hell in a Cell in a week's time. But you never know with WWE. But I think that now SmackDown has set themselves up with two on-the-rise babyfaces in Kevin Owens and Big E. And that's another thing I want to touch on. Really happy to see Big E continue down the singles push. Because I think, as Matt had mentioned, I'm sure a lot of you guys were thinking, when you saw the return of Kofi Kingston and you saw the return of Xavier Woods, you automatically just thought, like, well, that's the end of Big E's push. But they are really going down full steam ahead with this Big E singles push, and I really like it. Another thing coming over to SmackDown is Aleister Black. And look, I personally feel like his momentum has been just stopped dead in its tracks after a pretty solid start to the year. I remember when the year started, I guess, well, maybe not right when it started, but around April or May, I thought that he would have been a perfect contender for the WWE Championship at next year's WrestleMania against Drew McIntyre with the way he was going down and the momentum he was gaining. But now, kind of stopped in its tracks. I hope the program with Kevin Owens is done after taking the loss this past Monday night. But again, you never know with WWE. And aside from Kevin Owens and Big E, I guess you could throw Daniel Bryan into that mix as potential challengers for Roman Reigns' Universal Championship. But I just don't know when Daniel Bryan will be back here. And that's the thing that kind of scares me a bit, is that given the whole COVID-19, and I believe he has a newborn child, I don't really know if and when he will be back by the end of this year or in time for WrestleMania season. So I'll reserve judgment until he comes back and we can get an exact timeline on when he will be back in the ring. Over on the Raw side of things, well, look, they kept all of their big names. They kept Drew McIntyre. They kept Randy Orton. They held on to Keith Lee. They held on to the Hurt Business, which I'm really happy about. Retribution, meh, considering the way that they were going down, and they have that ongoing rivalry with the Hurt Business. I'm okay with it, I suppose. But they really knocked it out of the park on a couple of big name upper mid-card guys that they brought over from SmackDown. And most notably, it's AJ Styles, Jeff Hardy, and Sheamus. Sheamus is a guy to me that if Drew McIntyre somehow retains the championship against Randy Orton, which I wouldn't be opposed to, but I would like to see Randy Orton get it, I could see Sheamus versus Drew McIntyre as a very, very interesting program in the not-so-distant future. I think Sheamus, much like Kevin Owens, is a guy who still has a main event run left in him. The difference is that Sheamus probably doesn't have nearly as much runway left as a guy like Kevin Owens does, as Sheamus has been around for over 10 years, and Kevin Owens has really only been on the main roster for 5.5. But that's crazy, eh? 5.5 years Kevin Owens has been on the roster. It has really gone by in a flash. But getting back to Sheamus, I thought he was kind of getting drowned on SmackDown because SmackDown had like an overbearing amount of heels. And now you go over to Raw, and I'm not sure if they're going to turn him babyface. I wouldn't mind it. He hasn't been a babyface for, I would say, about 6 years now. And he's one of those guys that he can kind of play either role equally as well. So I wouldn't be opposed to it. But given that they've just gone down this new kind of direction with his character wearing like that old-fashioned coat, and I don't know if it's a fedora, but an old-style hat, I think they're going to continue down this path with him. But again, I would love to see him potentially go up against Drew McIntyre. And even if Randy Orton wins the WWE Championship, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing a Drew McIntyre versus Sheamus type of feud. I think that would be a very cool clash of styles. No pun intended, as I'm going to talk about AJ Styles in a second. And furthermore, one's Scottish, one's Irish rather. So just their respective nationalities would be something cool to pull off of. They also get Braun Strowman, who he's just kind of being twisted in the wind since losing the Universal Championship. And you kind of knew it, right? Like, I said to myself when it happened, and I'm sure a lot of you guys were as well, when he won the Universal Championship at WrestleMania over Goldberg, you basically knew they were just treading water until Roman Reigns came back, and then he was going to get that belt quickly upon his return. And that's what happened. He showed up on a Sunday, and the following Sunday he won the championship. So I feel bad for Braun Strowman. I'm not really sure if he's a babyface or a heel. He has that new look going on with like the dry fit shirt and the cargo pants, bald head. I assume that he's going to engage in a lengthy program with Keith Lee, which I'm all here for, which would make me draw a conclusion that he's a heel, but then he's facing Roman Reigns on this SmackDown for the Universal Championship. And that's another thing that Matt has been touching on a lot, but I'll just give my 2 cents on it quickly. If you're going to draft a guy to SmackDown, how can he fight a Raw champion? And vice versa, because in this case, it's a Raw guy fighting a SmackDown champion. And it just comes back to the fact of that they really don't care about the rules of the brand split, which I took a deep dive on last week when I did the whole Raw versus SmackDown from 05 review. And look, I'm not going to reiterate a lot of what Matt said because my feelings almost run parallel with his. But this is one thing that they had in the Ruthless Aggression era that I think was really good as opposed to what they have now. Nowadays, they have the SmackDown Tag Team Champions, the Raw Tag Team Champions, the Raw Women's Champion, and the SmackDown Women's Champion. Brand exclusive championships. But here's the thing. Back in the day, Raw had its own Tag Team Championship, but it was the World Tag Team Champion. SmackDown had its own Tag Team Championship, but it was the WWE Championship. Or the WWE Tag Team Championship, rather. So if those titles were interchangeable amongst the brands, and it was the same thing with the world titles, because back then they still had the WWE title, obviously, but instead of the Universal, they had the World Heavyweight, which, on a side note, I wish they had just brought back instead of creating a brand new Universal Championship, but that's neither here nor there. And when they debuted the Universal Championship 4 years ago, and it had the red strap, I said to myself, well, this is dumb, because maybe it doesn't have it in the name, but the strap itself almost makes it brand exclusive. And obviously it went to SmackDown last year and they simply just changed the strap to blue, which is fine, I guess. But to me, it just devalues the meaning of that title. But even beyond the meaning of the championship, you have Roman Reigns now defending the Universal Championship against Braun Strowman, who's a Raw guy, this coming Friday night. And I'm not against predictability, but this is just stupidity. And I don't get the point of this. Forget the fact that it's a world title match on SmackDown and not a pay-per-view. But we're just supposed to believe that Braun Strowman has a chance to win the title and bring it back to Raw. It just makes no sense. I don't get it. I don't know why they do these things. They don't think very far ahead of themselves. And, could anyone beyond the age of 8 years old really believe that Braun Strowman has a snowball's chance in hell of winning this match? And again, I'm not always opposed to predictability, but not when it coincides with stupidity. And look, it was another thing in the draft that bothered me, that when they split the New Day, I don't mind that they split the New Day. I actually really like it, as I previously said, but it's how they did it. Because the rules of the draft said factions or tag teams can get taken unless USA or Fox specifically picks a member or members. So Raw went first and picked Kofi and Xavier Woods, and then SmackDown went second and picked Big E. Would it have not made more sense for Big E to get picked first? Honestly, because you're telling me that USA only wanted Kofi and Xavier Woods, and Big E was the leftover scraps here? Again, I know they're not supposed to be wrestling GMs or very high in wrestling knowledge, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to watch the product over, the last 5 months and say, well, Big E's the hottest commodity right now and worth the most right now. It would have made more sense for SmackDown to take Big E first, and then Raw be like, okay, well, we might as well take the New Day. Because the whole point of this split is to say, well, Xavier and Kofi are going to continue down the tag team route, and Big E's going to eventually get a mid-card to main event push as a singles competitor. And it just didn't make sense to me that Xavier and Kofi went first, because again, I know WWE doesn't think this much, but for a fan like me who's been watching for 20 years, it makes me feel that they don't value Big E as much. And I know that's not the case, but if you're going with the true integrity of a sports draft, and they're really trying to emulate how real life drafts take place in real life sports, the guy with more value and the guy who the company thinks more highly of will go first. It's just common sense. And again, it's no big deal, but it's just another thing and another example of WWE really not caring about the little details when trying to tell a story. And the last thing I want to touch on the draft before we get on to rivalries, which I know is the reason why you guys are here, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling a bit, but it's AJ Styles. And AJ Styles is a guy that, for me, has been kind of twisting away in obscurity for over a year now. And personally, I think he's the best wrestler they have right now, both in the ring and character-wise, although his character has gotten a bit stale. It seems that ever since that Undertaker program at WrestleMania, it has just been a whole lot of meh for AJ Styles. And this is a guy that I know he's only been in WWE for, I want to say, 5 years now, this coming January. But he isn't exactly young. And I think he did an interview that said that he only has about 2 or 3 years left here. And I don't think they're really utilizing AJ Styles to the maximization of his to the best of his capabilities, rather. And here's what I would like to see with AJ Styles. I think he needs to go back babyface. While I like him as a heel, and as a whole, I probably prefer him more as a heel type of character, I think WWE is really lacking in the top babyface department aside from Drew McIntyre. I know you have up-and-coming guys like Keith Lee and Big E, and you still have Kevin Owens waiting, but aside from Drew McIntyre, there's no legitimate main event babyfaces they have on either Raw or SmackDown. You can make the case for Daniel Bryan, I guess, but he kind of seems to have 1 foot in, 1 foot out right now. You look over on Raw, Jeff Hardy, I suppose, but I don't think he's going to even sniff the World Championship scene. Maybe when Edge comes back, but again, he's more of a part-time guy. I just look at AJ Styles and I see a guy who, while I think as a whole he's a better heel, we know he's a good babyface. And they have a chance here with him going back to Raw, and I hope he stays on Raw just for at least the whole year, because he started at the draft last year in October, he was on Raw, then they switched him to SmackDown, and then he went back to Raw now. So he's just kind of been going back and forth and back and forth. And I know that had something to do with backstage heat with Paul Heyman, but I'm not going to analyze things I don't have all the information to. But I want them to really just find him a stable place on Raw, and that should be in the main event scene. And if you're asking me, and I'm not a guy who does this a lot, that fantasy books, I'm picking AJ Styles to win the Royal Rumble. And I know you guys may say, well, why? That should be for an upcoming guy like Big E or what have you. I wouldn't be opposed to Big E or Kevin Owens winning the Royal Rumble and going on to face Roman Reigns. But this is why I want AJ Styles to win it. Because I think he's a guy that, because he spent so much time in TNA and Impact Wrestling and only really came over in his late 30s to WWE, you don't really consider him one of the best wrestlers of the last generation, when in fact he is. As a whole, since 2016, I would say that AJ Styles is the best wrestler WWE has had. And I always just could not get over the amount of chemistry he had with John Cena, both in promos and in the ring. And after John Cena left, I almost felt like AJ Styles took on that role that John Cena had as the veteran main event guy who can tag in from time to time as the world champion, but mainly had a stay in the upper mid card, kind of like what John Cena was doing from, let's say, 2014 to 2016 in the final 2 years of him being a relatively full-time competitor. And I would like to see AJ Styles win the Royal Rumble to cement himself as a legitimate star of the last generation, because he is. And I'm not saying I would want him to go on and maybe win the WWE Championship from Drew McIntyre, because I do want to see McIntyre go into WrestleMania with the WWE Championship. Even if he drops it to Randy Orton in a short period, I would still want Drew to get it back in time for WrestleMania season. But that would be a program I would really like to see. It's been a while since they did babyface versus babyface going into a WrestleMania. I think the last time they did it was Nakamura versus AJ Styles, ironically enough. But I would love to see AJ Styles versus Drew McIntyre main event WrestleMania this year. And I just think AJ Styles is a guy that would very much benefit from a Royal Rumble victory in the final couple of years of his pro wrestling career, and a guy who deserves it. I love AJ Styles, and I think for the last year or so, they have been kind of wasting him. But enough of the current product. I know I went a bit longer this week than usual, but let's get into the reason why you guys are here, and that is Rivalries. And we're going to go back to start this in 2012, late 2012, when The Shield debuted at the Survivor Series pay-per-view and interfered in the triple threat match between CM Punk, John Cena, and Ryback for the WWE Championship. And they interfered, and they ended up costing Ryback the WWE Championship. And the Shield went on for about a year of just running roughshod on WWE, and I gotta say, they are one of the main things that pulled me back into really caring about the product again. Because, like I said, I really got drawn back in 2011 when The Rock came back. But after his initial return, and he was just kind of showing up every couple of months, trying to build his program to John Cena at WrestleMania 28 in 2012. Aside from that, I really wasn't all that interested because I know a lot of people liked it, but that era, the early 2010s, was a really dark time for me, and I really just didn't care a whole lot about the product. But when the Shield showed up, it really gave me kind of a feeling from an Attitude Era. They were a faction that I could have seen in the Attitude Era or the Ruthless Aggression Era. I liked their theme song. I liked their look. I liked the tactical gear. I liked coming down from the crowd. Everything about the Shield was something that I liked, and it drew me back in. So for 2013, they were pretty much a mid-card heeled faction, and they even aligned themselves with the Authority for a short bit as kind of like the heavies for Triple H when Randy Orton had first aligned himself and, cashed in Money in the Bank on Daniel Bryan following his SummerSlam championship win at SummerSlam 2013. And then you saw Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins win tag team championships. And then you saw Dean Ambrose win the U.S. title. So they were really going full steam ahead with pushing these guys. Early 2014 comes, and they had mainly been heels. Well, actually, entirely been heels for I would say, 14 months that they had been on the main roster. But WWE started dipping their toes into the prospect of potentially turning them babyface. And we saw them have a short run-in with the Wyatt family, who obviously were full-blown heels at the time. And then they had a WrestleMania match with Kane and the New Age Outlaws, who were heels. So they hadn't done a complete babyface turn yet, but WWE was definitely dipping their toes in the water to see how the reaction from the fans would be. And you always knew with the Shield, or shortly after their debut, that if WWE ever decided to turn them babyface, the crowd would absolutely love them. Because they were guys who had perfect heel heat. All of the NXT maniacs loved them because they were big NXT guys, especially Seth Rollins. And they had a really cool vibe about them. It was just something about the Shield when they first showed up that was almost as a blast from the past, like something that we hadn't seen in quite some time in WWE, just an ulterior look. It was almost like what they're trying to do with Retribution now, except they knocked it out of the park with the Shield, and they've fallen flat on their face with WWE. And the one thing about the Shield, and their one motto, was always justice. They were the hounds of justice. That's what they cared about, and that's what they lived by. And that's how they started slowly transitioning into the babyface side of things. But while the Shield were slowly but surely starting to turn babyface very gradually, if you remember, in 2014, that was the Yes Movement, when, WWE single-handedly got forced by the fans into changing the main event of WrestleMania 30. When it was supposed to be Batista versus Randy Orton, but it ended up being a triple threat match with Daniel Bryan being in there. And Daniel Bryan's feud with the Authority and Triple H more specifically was on full display at this point. So WrestleMania comes and goes. He beats Triple H to get into that triple threat match to main event WrestleMania 30. He gets in there, and then despite interference from Triple H and Stephanie McMahon, despite Batista and Randy Orton teaming up on him during the match, Daniel Bryan finds a way to win and become the WWE Undisputed World Champion, because at this time they had just unified the World Heavyweight titles and the WWE Championship. So the following night on Raw, Daniel Bryan opens the show, and he comes out to just an absolute chorus of cheers. They are going ballistic for Daniel Bryan. And Triple H comes out and, pissed off as all hell, says, "You're going to face me tonight on Raw for the World Heavyweight Championship, the WWE World Heavyweight Championship." So it was a pretty cool atmosphere, and you think like, okay, they're gonna knock this match out of the park, and Daniel Bryan's gonna beat Triple H again, and it's just gonna be yet another victory to cement Daniel Bryan as a main event player after months being told he is a B+ player by the Authority. But he comes to the ring, and before the match could even start, you get Batista and Randy Orton come out and beat the holy hell out of him. Then Kane comes out, and if you remember, at this time, Kane was the director of operations, so he had no mask on, would come out in a suit, and he comes out seemingly to regulate the situation, but then he chokeslams Daniel Bryan. So Daniel Bryan is just getting destroyed by Batista, Randy Orton, and Kane, and then, lo and behold, Triple H makes his way out to the ring and forces the referee to ring the bell and start the match despite Daniel Bryan being incapacitated. So the bell rings, Daniel Bryan is lying motionless on the ring mat. Triple H is mocking the crowd, doing the yes chant. So is Stephanie McMahon. You have Kane, Batista, Randy Orton looking on the outside, and it seems that Triple H has this championship win in the bag when this happens.
No condition to compete right here. But Triple H said if you want your job, ring the bell. Wait a minute. Before bad news for Daniel Bryan. The Hounds of Justice making their way into the arena.
So as you guys heard, the Shield comes out to make the save on Daniel Bryan. And it was a really cool visual this entire time because the Shield comes out to the ring and they get on one side of the ring, on the ring apron, and Kane, Randy Orton, and Batista get on the other side, and they're having a stare down with Triple H trying to mediate in the middle. And you may ask, well, why is Triple H trying to mediate? Why would he bother wasting time with the Shield? Well, earlier on in that night, he had actually informed the Shield that if anything were to go sideways, you guys were going to come in and be the difference makers and help me get what needs to be done. Because like I said, they were kind of baby faces, but they still had not fully turned and ultimately were still heels. And in the past, just 5 or 6 months prior, they had been pretty much lackeys and henchmen for the Authority. So it made sense that Triple H was trying to reason with them. You heard him telling them to, stand down, and then he's telling Kane, like, we're not breaking this down into a war, because obviously Kane had his run-ins with the Shield in the weeks leading up to it. But ultimately, Triple H turns around, eats a spear from Roman Reigns, and the Shield clear the ring and Daniel Bryan ends up getting up, nailing Triple H with the flying knee, and thus completing the babyface turn of the Shield. So the Shield go on to, pretty much keep on standing up to the Authority and doing what they have to do. And eventually they get put in a match against pretty much the entire Raw roster. Well, not the entire roster, but all of the heels in WWE, all the mid-card heels get put up against the Shield. And they get beaten down in an 11-on-3 handicap match. And at the end of this handicap match that I don't think even had an official end to it, and they're just being beaten down by all these guys, next thing you know, a very familiar music hits that we hadn't heard in about 10 years.
But this may go from bad to worse. The band is back together. Triple H. Orton and Batista. One of the strongest factions in WWE history. Known as Evolution. This can only be trouble. The Shield can only thank themselves. The greatest teams of all time is about to unleash hell. And apparently Evolution is joining forces for a common goal. And the Shield has now become all three of these men's problem. This yard may now belong to Evolution. Triple H calling up the dogs. Yeah, but the damage has been done.
So Evolution makes its return. The first time you had seen Batista, Triple H, and Randy Orton standing side by side in 10 years. So think about what had gone on in 10 years between these three guys. Batista and Triple H had just a crazy rivalry in 2005. Randy Orton attacked the entire McMahon family in 2009. He broke Batista's arm in that same year. So there was no love lost between any of these three individuals. And you heard one of the commentators say it, I believe it was JBL, saying all coming together for a common goal. And like I said earlier in the podcast, is that the Shield kind of gave me a throwback to a feeling I had and that I hadn't had, rather, in close to a decade since the Ruthless Aggression era. And when I saw Evolution walk out and just basically take advantage of a beaten down Shield, I realized that the Shield really reminded me of Evolution. And it wasn't for the fact of how they looked aesthetically or their common goal or how they came out to the ring or any of that or their styles of wrestling. None of that. But it was in the sense that it was a faction that felt like a main event player. And that's how Evolution felt in the Ruthless Aggression era. That even though at times that aside from Triple H, they were mainly just a mid-card faction that would, contend for the tag team titles and the Intercontinental Championship, if they got put in the main event scene, it felt that like they belonged. And that's how I felt about the Shield. They felt that from the get-go that they had main event potential. It didn't take me long to get behind Rollins, Reigns, and Ambrose and say, yeah, I really think that WWE could build the future behind these three guys. And that's the same way I felt about Batista and Randy Orton back in 2004. And it didn't take me long to feel that way about them either, much like I did about The Shield in, let's say, early 2013. So when Evolution made their return here, it really made me realize, like, man, there are so many parallels between these two groups, and it's almost like timelines are clashing here. Generations are clashing, because who would have ever thought we would have seen Evolution back together and to go up against The Shield? And I'll just say it now that in the last 20 years, these are probably the two best factions WWE has had to offer. You can make the case for the new incarnation of Degeneration X, I guess, in the early 2000s with the McMahon-Helmsley regime, but it doesn't match up against the original DX. And these two, The Shield and Evolution, are the two best the WWE has had in the last 2 decades. And maybe that's why I like the Hurt Business so much, is that it's made me feel like a similar admiration towards a faction that I haven't felt, let's say, since The Shield. And I think factions are something that has gone by the wayside a bit in WWE, and I think they should go back to more. So Evolution reforms and thus officially kicks off the rivalry between the two teams. And the first encounter that they would have would be at Extreme Rules 2014, where the Shield would go over on Evolution, beating them in a 6-man tag team match. But then it set the stage for their second match at Payback at the beginning of June. And this one was the one that everyone remembers, because it not only main evented the show, but it also was a no-holds-barred match and an elimination match. And if you guys don't remember, this is where the famous Blue Tista thing came from, when Batista came out in full blue gear for whatever reason, and just the crowd started chanting Blue Tista, and I think social media had it trending and whatnot. But once again, the Shield goes over on Evolution and just sweeping them in back-to-back matches. And this really solidified the Shield as a true top faction in, I would say, the history of WWE. And I'm confident in saying that because it solidified them against probably the best faction in WWE history, or at least of the last 2 decades, in Evolution. So the next night on Raw, Evolution comes out and Triple H says, we're not done with the Shield until it is no more. And that results with Batista saying, this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I wanted when I returned to WWE earlier this year. And lo and behold, he walks out on WWE and quits just 6 months after returning to the company. But Triple H was adamant that the only way that this rivalry would end is when the Shield was no more. And that's what resulted in the closing segment of that Monday Night Raw.
In case you haven't figured it out yet, what I do better than anybody is adapt. Last night was plan A. Tonight, plan B. There's always a plan B. Are you kidding me? Rollins down. He's assaulting Ambrose. Rollins assaulting Ambrose after he took out Reigns. What is going on here? You guys are on top of the world. Why in the world would Seth Rollins do this? My God, Rollins is destroying Ambrose. Broke that chair over. Broke that chair over Ambrose.
So I don't have to tell you guys what happened. I'm sure all of you guys have watched it time and time again. Seth Rollins turns his back on the Shield and completes one of the most infamous heel turns in quite some time, thus imploding the Shield. And he beat the hell out of them with chairs, gave Dean Ambrose the stomp onto a steel chair. Then Randy Orton got in the ring, had his own little fun with the chair at the expense of Ambrose and Reigns, and thus completed the rivalry between Evolution and the Shield. And I think that this rivalry is very important for numerous reasons. Number one, it solidified the Shield as main event players and one of the best factions of all time. They beat arguably the best faction of all time in Evolution in 2 matches and did so in quite convincing ways. And getting wins over the names such as Triple H and Randy Orton and Batista is something very, very substantial in WWE, especially when you guys have never been main event players in your own right. Like, it's one thing if you've been being pushed as a single star for a couple months and then you finally go over on a big name in the company. But this was different in the sense that these guys were, by all intents and purposes, just a mid-card faction, a mid-card heel faction to boot. And seeing the fact that Creative was able to book them in 2 victories over the likes of Evolution was very telling on how WWE management felt about them. And furthermore, this rivalry ended the Shield. And I know we've had reincarnations of it over the past few years leading up to the departure of Dean Ambrose, but it never really quite felt the same. And to be honest, I felt that they just did too fast. It had only been 3 years when they did the initial reunion in the fall of 2017, and I just felt it was too much, too quick, and they should have let it breathe a bit. But I guess in hindsight, it's probably a good thing that they did it because Dean Ambrose ended up leaving and is now Jon Moxley in AEW, so they wouldn't have had the chance to now. But Evolution ended the Shield. So it's very important in the sense that they solidified them as main event players, but at the same time, they ended the faction as we knew it. And it's a very weird dynamic because you're saying, well, if they're solidifying them as main event players, but they also ended them, how could both be true? But it's because we knew at this point, maybe subconsciously, that Dean Ambrose, Roman Reigns, and Seth Rollins were all ready for prime time, at least in my opinion. And it was weird because Seth Rollins was the one who, right out of the gate, got the biggest push. And before this happened, I would have argued that he was kind of the odd man out. He was kind of the third wheel to this group. Because if I think back to the Shield in 2013 and early 2014, I looked at it and I said, well, Roman Reigns is clearly the guy that WWE likes and will likely be a babyface. Dean Ambrose has the lunatic psycho thing going on, so he's going to be a full-blown heel. And Seth Rollins is just the acrobatic guy who's excellent in the ring. And that's just my opinion on it. Maybe you guys have a differing one. But I always thought that Seth Rollins would be the least likely to have main event potential when they all broke. So when they decided to have Seth Rollins be the guy to turn on the Shield and have the most significant character development right off the bat and win the Money in the Bank briefcase shortly thereafter and get J&J security and all these things, I just found it very, very intriguing and a brilliant part on creative because, look, lo and behold, since then, Seth Rollins has become one of the most prominent wrestlers in the company. And it just really set the stage and the landscape for WWE for the following, 6 years since this happened? And lo and behold, these guys have in large part been the faces of the company. The one thing that I am kind of sad about looking back on the Shield and the dissolution of the Shield is that I really wish they would have had at least one-on-one match between any of the two of the three. Because at a WrestleMania, I would have liked to see two of the three go head-to-head at a WrestleMania that we haven't been able to see to this point. I really thought at WrestleMania 32 when Seth Rollins was out with injury and John Cena was out with injury and Randy Orton was out with injury that Roman Reigns versus Dean Ambrose would have been a perfect main event and, two Shield members, maybe two baby faces going one-on-one. but they elected to go with Roman Reigns versus Triple H, which was one of the worst WrestleMania main events of all time, in my opinion. But maybe we'll get to see it with Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns somewhere down the line. They're both on SmackDown now, so maybe, but they're both newly turned heels, so who knows if that is anything in the cards in the near future. But this feud between Evolution and The Shield was big in so many ways by solidifying them as main event players and breaking them up to send them on their separate ways as single stars. So look, guys, that's about all I got for this week in terms of rivalries. It was more of a recent rivalry that I hope you guys are good with. I know usually I do 15 plus years ago, but this was just something I'd been thinking about for a while. And I'm kind of on this kick of faction versus faction rivalries. So I hope you guys are good with that too, as opposed to the traditional one-on-one rivalries. Just trying to think about a bit outside the box. So as always, you can @ me on Twitter at @ADemarco25. You can email Matt at realwwepodcast@gmail.com. If you want to leave him questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them, or @ me on Twitter or DM me on Twitter. Some of you have DM me on Instagram. That's cool too. My handle is also @ADemarco25. Or you could leave a voicemail for Matt, and he would be glad to relay that for me. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you this week, and I will talk to you next time.